Welcome to forecasting. Get to have some math, but it's not exclusively math. Sometimes forecasting has a mathematical element to it. Sometimes it has a qualitative or judgment aspect to it. We get to do both of them in this particular unit. So this is great, right? Math is fun. Okay, so essentially when we're forecasting, we're trying to make some estimate for the future, right? As we were talking about in the intro section, our views of the future impact how much resources, how much equipment, how much raw materials, how much human capital we accumulate in order to meet that future demand. So the forecast, important key to everything that happens, both on the operations side, but even in the overall company side as well. Now, we can be forecasting a variety of things. So it's not just always a sales forecast. We could be forecasting prices as well. Okay, we could be forecasting the availability of supply. There could be supply shortages, and we've seen this through our experiences in 2020, all sorts of various supply shortages within the supply chain. So we could be trying to forecast supply coming onto the market. Now, forecasting, what makes it really interesting is also what makes it really, really hard, is that it's not just punching numbers into an algorithm and getting an answer out. So there's some of that, but there's also an art to it. There's a judgment to it. There's a thinking to it. Because when we do all that model crunching, we crunch all those numbers, we run them through the most wonderful models in the world. Oh, these are great models. Fantastic. We get a number, we get a result. How do we know that result's not just a bunch of BS? Judgment. Still got to use the old noggin. Still have to do some thinking here. All right, we get a number, so what? Maybe all the modeling that went into that number doesn't mean anything. Paradigm shift. Stuff is different now. I mean, we look at supply chains in 2021 versus 2019. Holy cow, who knows what it's going to look like going 2021? I mean, is the global supply chain sort of in danger a little bit? Are we going to be more localized in our supply so that we can be assured that we actually get the products? Or are we going to kind of have an adjustment period and go back to the way it was before? Don't know, right? Who knows? So element of not just science, but there's art there. With that means there's always going to be there's going to be wrong there. You're never going to get it exactly right. You have to learn it, accept it, embrace it. You're trying to minimize your error, but you're never going to eliminate it. It's just the way it goes. It's always going to be things you didn't see happen, and go figure. So we can use those forecasts, and sometimes general forecasts are good enough. If we knew with certainty whether the stock market was going to go up or go down on a given day, that would be a very useful model. However, if we had a model that sort of gave us guidance as to whether the CPI was going to go up or go down in a certain period, that's pretty much useless. CPI typically, with the odd rare exception, goes up. It's a trend up. Stock market goes up, goes down. It's got an overall trend up or down, but far more volatile than CPI. So it would be useful to have a market, a stock market model that would give us the ups and downs. So far, one doesn't exist, and certainly not one that anybody's willing to share. Okay, so we have some major types of forecasts. Clearly, the demand forecast is a predominant one. And here's kind of interesting. 2019 forecast revenues for worldwide air travel, $606 billion. Bet you the forecast for 2020 was probably similar to that, maybe a little bit higher. That forecast kind of hit a bumpy spot. And then we can take that forecast and we can then apportion it down into subunits. So for instance, if your overall company's forecast for sales is X, and then your division accounts for a certain proportion of X, we can use that scaling in order to determine a forecast for your particular division or your particular sector. We can also use this overall forecast, which usually is pretty good, and then there's a lot of estimates for the overall market. And if we use many of them, we can maybe try to reduce our variability that way. There's a little bit of groupthink that goes on with some of these forecasts. Nobody really wants to be too terribly out from the pack, so there's a little bit of bias there. A little bit of herd mentality, if you will. But we can take that overall forecast for the industry and say, okay, well, our business accounts for a certain market share in that industry. Therefore, if market share holds constant, we would expect our forecast to be X. And supply forecasts, right? I mean, and this one can be a tricky one, and we've seen in 2020 that supply forecasts are more important than they've ever been. Sometimes it's taken for granted. People assume that if there's a demand, there will automatically be a supply. Turns out maybe that's not as solid a rule as we once thought, and so supply forecasts are important. In commodities, it's not unusual to have huge supply disruptions, and so the people in the oil business are used to that. If there's conflict in the Middle East, or conflict in Nigeria, or conflict in Venezuela, that does have an impact on supply forecasts for oil, and the oil industry is pretty. I don't know if you want to say accustomed to it, but they've seen it. It's been seen before. It's not an unusual aspect. What's new is we usually don't see it in toilet paper or ground beef or those kind of regular, stable, staple products. But it seems to be changing. So lots of issues going into, again, those supply forecasts are becoming now more and more important, because you may have a great demand forecast, you may have a demand for your product, but if you're unable to source your raw materials or intermediate materials, that becomes a very big issue, right? Price forecasts, we talked about that in a couple seconds ago. Price forecasts, of course, are always important. Often when we look at forecasting, we try to forecast the number of units sold and keep sort of price separate, because those are two different forecasts. So often we won't, if it is possible, one tries to avoid a sales forecast without price information, unless you're just a strict price taker and the price is fairly stable, and it really doesn't matter. And sometimes it makes sense to just do a sales forecast, because that's the info that's available, and there's not a big loss of. There's not a big sacrifice in accuracy by doing so. But if you're in a volatile business where price does fluctuate quite a bit, then you may find it better to do a demand forecast for the number of units that you expect to sell, and then have the projected price as something, a separate forecast. And if you're a price taker in a volatile business or with a lot of price volatility, that's probably the way you're going to go. Anything, used vehicle prices were expected to fall by 6.2% in 2020. I don't know what the 2021 numbers are, and I'm not even sure that they're relevant anymore, because like I was commenting before, our experiences with 2020 have really thrown forecasting out the window, because all those past estimates, that the past history that we would normally base a forecast on, a lot of those rules and a lot of history has been at least temporarily suspended. I don't know if it's been permanently suspended or not, and whether we're just in a whole new world and a whole new paradigm, or it's just this is a temporary fluctuation and that will begin to converge back into normal historical norms, I guess, or two historical norms. So forecasts, unfortunately, whenever you make a forecast, you're likely to be wrong, likely to be out by a little bit. You're trying to minimize how much you're out by, but you will be wrong. It's sobering. You put a big forecast out there, everyone sees it. So for instance, stock market forecasts come out every January, visible to all. Everyone sees it. And you know that you're probably going to be wrong. You just hope not to be wrong by an embarrassing amount, or to be wrong by a worse measure than your peers. Let's put it that way. So some predictions. So in BMO, now I'm not picking on BMO for any reason other than they. U.S. predictions tend to be easier to find than Canadian stock market predictions, and BMO is got a large presence in their brokerage in the United States, and so recognizable name that does forecasting in the U.S. and is willing to put their forecast out there. So they predicted the U.S. S&P 500. That's just an index of the 500 largest stocks traded on the New York Stock Exchange in the United States. By the end of 2020, they said it would be 3650. Turns out it was 3756, which actually is a pretty doggone good forecast considering all the crazy volatility that went on in 2020. That's actually really, really good. In 2018, they predicted they would reach 2950. It reached 2510. Oops, not so good. At the beginning of 2019, the BMO predicted that it ended at 3,000. It actually ended at 3,230, so out by almost 6% there. So you can kind of see that, when you look at it from a percentage point of view, other than 2020 for some really weird reason, out by pretty large percentages. And this is not an aberration. You could look at JP Morgan, you could look at any Morgan Stanley, all out in percentage terms. When you consider the average percentage return on stock market is between 7 and 9%. When you're out by 4 or 6 plus, or in some cases in 2018 quite even more than that, that's actually a huge amount to be out by. So even the 100 out there out by in 2020 still represents 2 percentage points off of about a 10% return. So that's it's still a forecast that's quite a bit deviant from actuality. If you want to look up some of the forecasts, I've left some links there that you can go and check them out and see how the predictions are for this year. CNBC also lists the predictions and what they are for how they did in 2020 as well. So it's nice to see that comparison. Not a big surprise that forecasts in the near term are more accurate than forecasts in the longer term. Pretty confident in what even now with all the volatility we've experienced in the last 10 months to a year. The volatility that we'll experience between now and tomorrow. I'm talking here on January the 4th. Between January the 4th and this time on January 5th, probably nothing too radical. But as you get further and further out, the potential for extreme events or unanticipated events clearly increases more. The chance of good things and bad things happening increases, our time horizon increases. Forecasts for groups of products or services tend to be more accurate. This is, we remember, maybe if we remember back to our first stats experience and we saw central limit theorem. In this, it's not exactly the same, but it relates to it, is that when we're averaging and aggregating, we sort of beat out a little bit of the volatility. So some random volatility in one area is sort of canceled out by some random volatility in another area. And so we can see where we look at groups, we see a little bit less volatility. Okay. A forecast is no substitute for a calculated value. It's kind of a duh statement, but still needs to be said. Obviously, if you have the real value, that's important. The forecasted value is not worth anything if you know what the actual value is. Sometimes some folks tend to hold on to those forecasts as if they're hard truths when they're just what they are. They're forecast. Okay? And we've seen that a lot, especially in 2020, where the forecast the prediction has assumed its own life, and it's easy to lose or to be distracted by that and lose perspective in the fact that, did that actually happen? How did that model do? How did that forecast do? And we see when we're forecasting complex systems, like say the stock market, which is a very complex system, our forecasts are inaccurate. Let's put it that way. We just lack the data and the modeling to make really good forecasts with really complex systems. Okay, so a couple of the terms, and I know terms are never very exciting, but we do need to understand the language a little bit in order for any of this to make sense. And in our forecasting, we're going to focus in on time series data. Okay. As far as forecasting models go, the three most popular, most used forecasting models are linear regression, exponential smoothing models, and weighted moving averages. Linear regression you will have seen or will see in your second statistics class, Management Science 312. And it's not necessary for this class, so if you haven't seen it, don't start to sweat it out. And then in this class, or in this course, we'll take exponential smoothing models and weighted moving averages. So between the two courses, you'll have been exposed to the three most popular sales forecasting tools used in the real world. So that's really good. So we have 5 basic patterns of these time series. So time series just means we're looking at how this data fluctuates or trends or changes just simply over a time period. So horizontal, around some constant mean, so unchanging, but there is some fluctuation, but it fluctuates around a constant. A trend means that there's a systematic increase or decrease. That means even though in any one period the data may go up or go down, the overall trend of the data is to go up. So stock market, for instance, has an upward trend. There is an upward trend in the stock market, but a lot of volatility up and down. So when we talk about the average stock market going up by between 7 and 9% per year, that's coupled with a standard deviation of 22% per year. So significant up and down, as that, even though that trend is upward, there is a lot of up and down and volatility and variability in that upward trend. Okay, but nevertheless, there is still an upward trend. Seasonal factors, that becomes very important for us, and we'll work with adjusting for that issue, and it just basically states that within the overall time period, so let's say if we look at a year, which is the easiest one to look at, we know that typical for most businesses, especially retail businesses, the quarter that Christmas falls in is busier than, let's say, the first quarter, January to the end of March, which tends to be a slower period. If you're looking at vacations, perhaps there tends to be kind of a slow period. I think it's in the spring. Things pick up into the summer, and depending on the locale, picks up again in around Christmas, especially if it's a warm weather spot. So we can see that there's regular fluctuations at certain periods of the year, right? Certain periods of the year are better than other periods of the year. But we can also see these seasonal patterns in shorter time frames as well. So if you work in a restaurant, so any of you that work in a restaurant know that typically Friday and Saturday, the weekends, are busier than, let's say, a Tuesday. Right, and there's a pattern to that, and then that tends to be a fairly regular pattern. Maybe it doesn't hold for every Tuesday versus Friday, but it holds for most of them. Right? And so that's just a seasonal pattern. Cyclical patterns, on the other hand, a little bit more of a longer-term trend, and perhaps a little bit harder to forecast. So, for instance, recessions or the business cycle, we sort of know that eventually there'll be a little bit of an up and then a retrenchment down and then an up and then a retrenchment down. But when that occurs, is a lot harder to predict. Seasonal patterns, easier to predict. They're more prevalent. Friday at a restaurant tends to be busier than Tuesday at a restaurant. But cyclical overall business cycle patterns, we know they'll happen, but when is highly variable. Okay, and then sometimes stuff's just random. We just don't know why. Why did you do that? Like, why is all of a sudden this a hot item and it wasn't before? Why? Who knows? Some celebrity walks across the street wearing a certain piece of clothing, and all of a sudden everybody needs to have it. Somebody, Princess Kate shows up in a blue dress done by such and such, and next thing you know, everybody wants a blue dress done by such and such. Go figure. Random stuff. Really, really hard to predict that. And of course, living through a pandemic, that's really hard. That makes a mess of your forecasts. Pretty hard to forecast that, right? Pretty hard to forecast that. Okay, so again, continuing on. What to forecast? Sometimes we want to know the demand for individual services or goods, and like we were talking about before, sometimes we take the overall total demand and then split it out. It tends to be the easiest way to do it. It's got some, not saying it's a perfect way, but tends to be the easiest way, and tends to be something where you have the information available to do that. Okay. Preferably, we like to do the forecast for the units, whatever those units are, whether those units are number of products, whether those units are some sort of service unit, number of hours, number of minutes, that kind of thing. Prefer to forecast that and then keep price separate, but sometimes it's just not possible. Aggregation, that's essentially just where we're starting to make forecasts for groups. And then from that aggregated data, forecast for individual items. Only because it can be hard to get the exact data for each individual item. We do it that way because we are in a real world field, and we can't let perfect be the enemy of good, and sometimes we just have to pick a methodology that, whilst not perfect, is better than nothing, and we need to have some forecast, and looking at the aggregated data, which often is available, and then using that to break down into subunits can be the most feasible way to do this, the most cost-effective way to do this. As well as if we're introducing little tweaks and changes to a product, we can then use this methodology and then mix it in with some of the judgment methods. Right now, I'm making the assumption, and my bias is trending. Well, this is a quantitative forecast, and it doesn't necessarily mean that we're bound for it to be a quantitative forecast. We could have a quantitative forecast, but then adjust it based on judgment. Hey, we broke it down. We had this overall aggregated data. We split it into its subcomponents or the product SKUs. But we did do some changes on one of the products, and we think that that'll be generally positive. So we're going to sort of revise our estimate or our forecast just up by a little bit to reflect that we think that this change will be positively received by the market. It turns out maybe it is, maybe it's not, but you make those kinds of judgments. So again, we don't keep our business sense, we don't throw our business judgment out the window because the numbers come spitting out of an Excel sheet. Definitely do not want to do that. Units of measurements, again, we've talked about this already, and I think I've already droned on about that. So we have certain judgment methods and certain qualitative decision-making tools or forecasts that we can use, and judgment methods are good, and they have their place, and we take opinions from people that have a certain expertise in the area or who deal with end customers, and say, okay, what do you think? Right? Where do you think this will go? What do you forecast? If we look at enough of these, ask enough of these people, you can get a pretty accurate sense for where things are going to end up. And there's a lot of popular books out about this, about when they, doing forecasting by interviewing a wide variety of people, and sometimes that wide variety of people can be across functional areas. It can, just to get a different perspective, you can ask people that maybe you wouldn't have normally thought to ask, that maybe aren't in that industry, but sort of know what you're talking about and can kind of think the problem through. So judgment methods. Causal methods, we use historical data, and that's where we start to get into linear regression, which we're not going to worry about too much. And then time series data. That's where we look at just historical trends, not necessarily breaking down why it was that way, but just trends that is the way that it is. There's also Salesforce estimates, so especially when you're maybe tweaking a product, changing it a little bit, or introducing a new one, Salesforce estimates can be useful. They are the folks that are most in touch with your customers and perhaps have a strong idea or a decent idea as to the thinking of the customers. And you might find that it's useful to ask them questions. It tends to be a little bit of a positivity bias there. I think in order to do sales, I've done sales before. I think in order to do sales, you sort of have you do have that positivity bias that you can sell anything to anybody, or hey, you can make this work. So Salesforce estimates can tend to be a little bit more on the overly optimistic side, but they do have the advantage of being very close to the customer as well. Executive opinion. Okay, so people who have experience in the industry or in that area, you ask those folks, well, what do you think? There's also market research where it's a little bit more formal. Perhaps you have interviews, there's surveys, even focus groups, and so there's a very more systematic process than just soliciting opinions. Although soliciting opinions can be something that can be a little bit more formal. So when you think of the Delphi method here, where we actually solicit the opinions of experts, that was originally designed by the Rand Corporation post-World War II. And it was a very systematic approach to surveying experts in a field. This one had to deal with the consequences of nuclear war. So, pretty serious stuff. And then just sort of getting expert opinion as to, well, how do you see this coming? And so that was, or how do you see this developing, or what are the key issues, and so on. And the process with the Delphi method, again, it's kind of systematic as well, is they solicit the individual forecasts, they're shared with the group, and then after that, person's allowed to modify them. If somebody raises an issue that goes, okay, that sort of makes sense, I can see that, and they can then make their adjustment and so on. And then this process sort of continues until some consensus is reached. As you can well imagine, can be very expensive because you're talking about experts and their time. It can also be very time consuming because, again, it can take a long time to reach this consensus. Panel consensus for forecasting brings the experts together, so they're all under one roof, so to speak, and it brings them all together. And they then can hash out. A little bit susceptible to groupthink in that one or two people can maybe dominate the others and bias your forecast as a result. Life cycle analogy method is interesting and is popular in those cases where what you are introducing is very new. And you don't have, obviously you're using, this is a judgment method, it's a qualitative method, and it's just not the background, there's not the history. But you've seen similar products, you've seen a similar history. It's a matter of now discerning which similar history fits. That can be really, really tricky, right? Okay, hey, this product, I'm sure it's similar to this, and somebody else will say, no, it's similar to this other thing, and so there's scope for controversy in this one as in all of them. But sometimes they can, as far as an industry goes, follows a certain cycle, right? And it's introduced, it grows, it matures, then it declines, it's replaced by something else. How fast does that all take place? That depends, right? You don't know. It can depend on the industry. For a more mature product, that can go for quite a long time. For maybe a tech or an app or phone, right? I think Samsung puts out a new phone every 6 months or so. That can be very, very short, right? So boom, it comes onto the scene, grows. That's it, replaced by something very quickly, right? Whereas I think of the tea that I'm drinking here, English breakfast tea, how often does that change? Not too much, right? It's pretty mature, and it's sort of hovering in that mature stage, and eventually maybe if people become less interested in drinking tea in general, there's a trend, it might go down. We see that a little bit in soda. It's a very mature, high cash flow product or high cash flow business. But the trend has been, it's in a slow decline. We're drinking less soda than we did, let's say, 10, 20, 30 years ago on a per capita basis. So it's in a slow decline. But that decline seems to not be especially rapid. Certainly not as fast as a Samsung phone or a iPhone 2 or something like that. Right, so that concludes this particular little segment. Get into the more quantitative aspects of this in the next ones.